You may be looking at my outfit and thinking, why is she wearing so much mismatched reptile-themed jewelry? But that would make you a fool. I am not wearing reptile-themed jewelry. See that? That's an amphibian. Hello, friends and enemies. Welcome to Horror and Inconvenience, where things are usually spooky and always weird. Today, I am here to do Criminale's Generally Speaking original tag. Now, of course, you'll have to watch Criminale's original video to get the full scoop, but basically, this tag is inspired by the Plagued by Visions Faces of Horror tag, but is engaged with trying to expand the conversation to a variety of genre fiction. Now, because I can't seem to do a tag without going a few steps farther than anybody asked or wanted me to, I'm actually going to choose 2 answers for each prompt, hoping that comparing and contrasting the books will spark a little bit of discussion, and also because I couldn't pick just one for any of these. So let's dive right in. First prompt is a horrifying book that isn't horror. So my 2 selections for this one are The Crucible by Arthur Miller and In the Dream House by Carmen Maria Machado. The Crucible, which I'm sure most of you have read, certainly my American readers would almost all have read it in school, is a play about McCarthyism, but it's set during the Salem witch trials. It's a lot more historically accurate to the Red Scare than it is to the actual Salem witch trials, but as somebody who's fascinated by both, I've always loved this play. Miller discusses the horrendous crime, the miscarriage of justice, that were the Salem witch trials, and that was the current political climate he was living under when he wrote this, in a way that really brings to light the sort of inevitability and helplessness and impotent rage that I associate with really good horror. And then, In the Dream House is a beautifully written, unconventional autobiography where Carmen Maria Machado describes an abusive relationship she was in a series of poetic, genre fiction-inspired vignettes. And there's a lot of really interesting stuff going on in here. There are footnotes throughout that relate different episodes in her life to tropes on the Arne Thompson Uther Index for Fairy Tale categorization, which is one of my favorite aspects of the writing. But at its core, this is the story of a horrible thing that happened to her that uses particularly tropes of fantasy, folklore, and sometimes supernatural horror to really bring out the psychological depths of this nonfiction narrative. So, in The Crucible, we have a story whose shape really in some ways conforms to the genre conventions of horror, and In the Dream House describes horrifying matter in ways that weaves in and out of the genre. The second prompt is a book with a terrible crime that isn't a crime novel. For this prompt, Olly himself chose Colson Whitehead's The Nickel Boys, which was an inspired choice, and frankly, in terms of any stories with realistic and really grave crimes, I didn't think that there was really an answer to this prompt that would top that without just kind of being a copy of it. Like, there are other There are other novels about historical crimes, like the one perpetrated in the story of Nickel Boys, but Olly already did that, so I decided to focus on less violent crime in my choice. So I don't know if terrible crime is really the way I would describe either of these. At least one of these, definitely. These are both comedies. So let's just go right into it. You'll see what my taste in humor is. So my choices are one I've talked about before in very different contexts. Kurt Vonnegut's God Bless You, Mr. Rosewater. And one of my favorite classical texts, which is Petronius's Satyricon. Also, incidentally, one of my favorite Fellini movies and one of Fellini's least favorite Fellini movies. Probably why I like it so much. So, probably the more serious crimes are committed in, well, do they murder anyone in the Satyricon? So in God Bless You, Mr. Rosewater, Vonnegut gives us a situation where an incredibly privileged character decides to go against the status quo in some ways that the other privileged characters that surround him find quite alarming. Elliot Rosewater is the heir to a Rockefeller Carnegie style family fortune, and he actually goes back to the town that his grandfather is from, Rosewater, Indiana, which is named after him. And he decides to slum with the regular poor people of that town and begins giving away gobs of his money to them. His estranged wife and various wealthy family members are horrified by this. They want to maintain the fortune so that they can have it. And so, with a couple of unscrupulous lawyers, they conspire to prove him insane and get him committed to an asylum so that they can control his resources. So, I mean, yes, legally that's a crime, that's fraud, but I think what's more important than the legality of it is the absolutely twisted lack of moral perspective amongst the characters. And I'm not saying Elliot Rosewater is necessarily particularly saintly. He's certainly a man with his own foibles, and he can often be just as condescending to the poor people he's trying to help as the people around him are. So, you know, it's not like Elliot Rosewater is great and is crucified. It's not that simple, which is what makes it a wonderful, warm, and hilarious novel rather than an exhausting allegory. But yes, both morally and legally, this novel does center around an attempted crime. The Satyricon is sometimes... I'm about to dive into some really dangerous waters here. There is an ongoing and unresolvable debate about what a novel is and what was the first novel. So depending on your criteria, it can have happened anywhere from ancient times to medieval times, all the way up to the 18th century. For a long time, Daniel Defoe was considered the first novelist, although that's been reevaluated, and if you're using the criteria that you would use to call Daniel Defoe the first novelist, then the first novelist is almost certainly the woman writer Aphra Bean, who wrote several decades before him. Really, whatever you call the first novel, odds are really good it was written by a woman, but The Satyricon has sometimes been called the first novel. It's a picaresque, humorous journey of two lowlifes named Encolpius and Aschiltus. And, yeah, these are men who... the narrative that we have is somewhat fragmented. Bits of it have been lost. It seems like Encolpius and Aschiltus don't necessarily come from particularly humble backgrounds. They might be minor heirs of some sort. But by the time the narrative picks up, they're already well into their kind of slumming lowlife phase. If they had money before, they seem to have lost it. And so they're bad people. They go through life stealing and conning people and getting into dangerous situations in their competition over the affections of a teenage prostitute. There's a lot of... Well, it's ancient Rome. There's a lot of really uncomfortable stuff with age and consent and sex in this, and also everything else ever written in ancient Rome. It's a problem. So it's about Encolpius and Aschiltus's friendship and probable romantic relationship as well, coming together and fracturing again as they go through all of these adventures amongst various strata of society, generally trying to con their way into the ability to have a good time and to feed their own egos. So there's a lot of petty crime in this, but there are also glances of a wider world whose moral and legal system is crumbling, as, if you ask me, throughout the whole history of the Roman Empire, it was always in the process of doing. And as someone living under the American Empire, I can definitely say that it's recognizable as something, as a project that was never sustainable to begin with. I'm not going to support this idea that Rome was great and fell into degeneracy. That didn't happen. It was never great. You can't make Rome great again. But yeah, so, at the time of Petronius, he was writing under Nero. He was actually a member of Emperor Nero's court. So, this is a humorous story about petty crime, but if you glance in the corner of your eye, you can see the much greater crimes of this regime taking place in the background. It's a fascinating story and very funny. Third prompt, a book about love that isn't a romance. Now, part of me, I love misinterpreting instructions. Malicious compliance is one of my favorite ways of being in the world. So I was a little bit tempted to pick out stories that didn't even feature romantic love for this one, but I know what Olly meant here. He meant stories that center romantic love in a way that is outside of the romance genre. And that is a great type of book that's totally worth talking about. So I am trying to answer this question as honestly as possible. So I chose the His Dark Materials trilogy by Philip Pullman and Maurice by E.M. Forster. His Dark Materials is, of course, fantasy, originally marketed to children. And in fact, I think I first picked up this book... Well, let's look. 95. Okay, so obviously I didn't pick this up when I was 3 years old. I think I was probably about 10 when I picked it up from the children's section for the first time. It's now that it's a complete trilogy and has gone through several waves of controversy, It's now marketed in the young adult section of bookstores, which I think is a huge mistake because this is a children's story about children. But of course, God literally dies at the end, so that's a battle I'm not going to win. However, the core of this trilogy taken as a whole, and spoilers for a series that's been finished for almost 20 years and has 2 screen adaptations. The core of the story is a love story between the children, Lyra, who's the main character of The Golden Compass, and Will, who becomes the secondary main character in the other 2 books. Lyra and Will are preteens. They go through puberty over the course of the series, and they befriend each other and fall in love, and according to a prophecy, are kind of a recreation of Adam and Eve that have a redemptive love story and sacrifice that is able to metaphorically undo original sin. Look, Philip Pullman has a huge bone to pick with Christianity, and that's what the story is about. But really, it is a touching, tender, and tragic love story in a sci-fi fantasy action universe. Absolutely wonderful. These books really do resist categorization in a lot of ways, and if you haven't read them in a while, give them a reread. I think you'll be surprised by how much was going on there. Maurice is one of the earliest novels about gay characters to have a happy ending. It's set in the late Victorian era to right before the beginning of World War I. And it's a kind of Bildungsroman about Maurice, who is a kind of hyper-masculine, very conventional, middle-class English boy who realizes as a young teenager that he's gay and accepts this about himself and tries to move forward in the world as a gay man who, well, it's not that he isn't ashamed of himself. Society was weighed pretty heavily on somebody like that. Still does. But it's that he didn't try to change himself. So there are 2 love stories in this. He falls in love with another boy at his university, but that man is ashamed of himself. He stays closeted and eventually marries a woman, and visiting him in an attempt to rekindle their romance toward the end of the story, he actually falls in love with his gardener. So it's a story about class and about social convention and about education. But I really think that there is... Well, there's a sad love story in the main story between Maurice and Clive, the other rich man. But then at the end, the love story with the gardener, Alec, it's this massive flourish of light and hope that feels almost like an extremely condensed romance novel. But all of this in a sort of literary coming-of-age novel. It's really a wonderful read. If you haven't read it yet, I highly recommend it. It's not long. Prompt number 4, a book with a puzzle that isn't a mystery. Thank goodness, I hate mystery novels. So for this one, I chose The Hobbit and Susanna Clarke's Piranesi. Y'all know what The Hobbit is. It's a fantasy book. It's the fantasy book. But I chose this because the riddles in this book were very fascinating and influential to me as a kid. Of course, there's the famous chapter, Riddles in the Dark, where Bilbo Baggins meets Gollum, and they have a sort of war of riddles over what will turn out in the Lord of the Rings trilogy to be Sauron's One Ring. This kind of war of the riddles, the ways that the language and metaphors are played with in these riddles and the ways that the rules are followed and broken was absolutely fascinating to me as a kid, and I think it helped me understand some of the limits and purposes of language, as well as just being a lot of fun. That old-fashioned battle of wits kind of fantasy really needs to make a comeback. It's such a good time. Great use of riddles. And some of the riddles themselves are actually interesting and puzzling. A lot of more recent fantasy novels that use riddles as plot points have depressingly obvious or absurdly obscure riddles. A great example of that is A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas. It has one of the most depressingly obvious riddles, and the whole plot hinges on this riddle for the second half of the book. I hate it. I hate that. Tolkien knew how to write a riddle. Piranesi, it's not so much that the book centers around a mystery or puzzle, although it does, but it's that the book itself is very puzzling. For those of you who haven't read it yet, I highly recommend it. Reading this book is like traveling to an alternate universe. I mean, it's about an alternate universe, sort of. It's not some kind of boring dimensional travel story, though. I honestly hate those. It's about... It takes place mostly in a sort of place between universes, and is mostly a series, at least the first section of the novel, which is the majority of the novel, is a series of diary entries by a man who lives in this between place and doesn't remember his past. It's fascinating how a person who's lost his memories can come up with new names and concepts for things. In a world where he's almost entirely alone. And it's something that you have to piece together as the characters do. Not in a way where you're guessing what comes next, but in the way that experiencing it alongside the character, at pace with the character, is the pleasure of the novel. A delightful read. Prompt number 5, a book with magic that isn't a fantasy novel. So for this, I chose the Winterhouse trilogy by Ben Guterson and Binti by Nnedi Okorafor. Winterhouse is a series of mystery novels, technically, for children, that do actually revolve quite a bit around word puzzles. But mysteries and twists aren't so much the point as the pleasure the characters take in the mysteries around them is the point. Which, for me, is what makes this so much more pleasant than I usually find a mystery read. But this is about a little girl who lives with her unpleasant aunt and uncle, and gets a mysterious invitation to spend Christmas at a place called Winterhouse, a hotel that is only open from Christmas to New Year's. She goes there and discovers, actually, that the person who runs the house is her grandfather. In the second book, he finally adopts her, thank goodness. None of that Harry Potter BS of just going back to an abusive home over and over again. I hate that. Anyway, but there's a mystery to solve, and she also discovers that she has some psychic powers. What I love about this is that the psychic powers are not what the plot revolves around. They're almost incidental. Like a lot of what goes on in these novels, it's color to a story that's really about whimsy and the delight of discovery. If you can't tell, I really love these books, and I highly recommend them. They're always what I hand to a kid who's just finished Series of Unfortunate Events and is on withdrawal, because, girl, me too. Always. Binti might be a little bit more of a controversial pick on this, because technically nothing in it is magic in universe, but here's the reason I chose it. So Binti is science fiction, but I think some of the uses of the sort of futuristic science are somewhat mystical because they're barely explained, and they function within the story and work on rules pretty similarly to how magic tends to work in fantasy books. It's science fiction, but the technology and even just like the use of mathematics in this story functions like a soft magic system in a fantasy novel. For example, the main character, Binti, can do miraculous things by essentially meditating on numbers. Something almost reminiscent of the Foundation series, except it has, I think, more magical effects. It's sci-fi where the science functions as magic, is what I'm saying. Okay, prompt number 6. A book that thrilled you that isn't a thriller. Okay, this is a fun one. So for this one, I chose A Deadly Education by Naomi Novak and Iron Widow by, I just read this, by Xiran J. Zhao. A Deadly Education is a fantasy novel with a hard magic system, and it's set in a school for teenage wizards where basically the flair in power that adolescent wizards have in this universe attracts monsters, and so the teenagers are shut up in a school together to learn magic and try to survive all the monsters that they attract. This is a really intense page-turner and an absolute delight to read. Iron Widow is a very recent book, and I just finished reading it. I'll be talking about it more in my spring wrap-up, but suffice to say, I love this book. I'm obsessed with it. This is, for my money, probably the new thing in the vein of the Hunger Games. Not that it's about a deadly competition, although there is deadliness and competition in it. But in that it's a story about rage and rebellion against an oppressive system. Yeah, couldn't put it down. Can't wait for the next book. Absolutely a page-turner, full of twists and turns, and just very propulsive. And for the final prompt, a book with science that isn't sci-fi. So for this, I chose The Knife Man, which is a biography of John Hunter, a 17th century surgeon, and Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe. So The Knife Man is non-fiction, and it is about early surgery in the UK and about sort of the very early dawn of... Hold on. Sorry, John Hunter worked in the 18th century, not the 17th century. My mistake. But he was one of the earliest proponents of what would become modern medical science, and also probably the person whom the character of Dr. Jekyll in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde was based on. A strange, ghoulish, morbidly curious man, just as much obsessed with odd things like taxidermy and keeping living exotic animals on his own property as he was with things like inoculating people with syphilis to find out its effects. Something that he probably also did to himself. he very much a real life man with a strong mad scientist vibe. So even though this is a nonfiction story, it had some elements of science fiction and horror to it, I felt. There's in a time when what we in the modern era think of the principles of biology were so unfixed, there's something inherently speculative about the sorts of things that a scientist did. And that, I think, very much gave it an edge of sci-fi and horror that really had me obsessed. I actually listened to this as an audiobook, and I thought, because of the amount of space it takes up in my brain, and the amount of time it felt like I was listening to it just because it loomed large in my life when I was listening to it, I thought it was a very long book. I ordered it into the bookstore I work at to make sure I could sell it to people. Found it's only about this wide, and I was astonished because it has the heft of a much longer book in my imagination. Ooh. Sorry if my eyes are a little red. It's spring and I'm allergic to the air. But the other book I wanted to talk about for this final prompt is Robinson Crusoe. This is a famous early 18th century novel, sometimes erroneously called the first novel, as previously discussed, about a man who is shipwrecked alone on an island. Well, not entirely alone. There are native people who actually live there, but they're pretty minor to the plot because this was written by an imperialist Englishman. But anyway, a massive chunk of this book is about how a man who has been relatively privileged and really only learned scholarly subjects in school might be forced, if he's taken away from society, to try and recreate basic arts and crafts and sciences that human society had come to be built on, at least in his part of the world, more or less from scratch, from his vague ideas of what they were like. There's a long section, for instance, where he tries to reinvent carpentry from scratch because while he knows what a chair should be like, he has no idea how to make one. It's fascinating, and I think there's very much an element of the scientific method in this, and the speculative element. It's not about what science could be, but it's sort of about how we might have come to do things. This novel really does have the vibe of a long, drawn-out thought experiment. At least the good parts of it do. It's fascinating. And to me, even though it's not like speculative fiction in the sense we usually talk about it, there's something of the same spirit there. So that's what I've got for you today. Thanks for tuning in to listen to me and my alligators and my snake, her name's Fiona, and my lizard and my lizard and my frog talk about some genre fiction. Hope you're all having great times. I am in a little bit of a reading slump right now, but I have some major projects I am trying really hard to barrel ahead on. So hopefully I should have some good stuff coming up for you at the very least later this month. Thanks for watching, and have a great day.